Well, welcome again to Epic Inspire, where we have open, honest conversations about ethics and ethical practice, as well as hopefully find some inspiring things for you and your work, or you as a person exploring or considering um, legal and informed use. Um, I'm Dr. Sandra Dreisbach, and I'm with Dr. Samuel Douglas. And today we're going to talk. Last time we talked about measuring ethics, the problems and complexities involving that. This time we're going to try and talk about what can we do. Um, if we can't measure it, what can we do? Um, what do you think, Sam? What are your first thoughts on this? Like, if we can't measure it, if we can't pick a rule stick to it, what are the sort of things that we can do?
Okay, so nothing complex. Just what it's a hard question, right? I think on the face of it, you sort of I personally find it daunting. Well, look, we can't measure it, we can't apply, we can't just measure uh, ethics. Then what can we do? It turns out that we can. There is a lot that we can do. It's just that it's not necessarily going to be as precise or as set
Yeah, it's
and
it's
measured
not an analytical
necessarily.
process as much as the analytics would like us to be, which is why ethics gets accused of being messy. But it's like I mean, like even trying to agree upon a standard, right, is challenging. Um, and and even though I know Epic has a list of different like guidelines and supports like the psychedelic safety flags, and there's like some standards of care that are put up there as possible, some agreements that are out there in the space. But again, there isn't universal agreement in the space about what those standards should be.
Hmm.
Um, and if we can't fully measure an individual practitioner, there's not a standard of professional conduct, either nationally or internationally or locally, although there's some standards that are out there and that are being worked on and being developed. Uh, but that doesn't mean, we're becoming ethical because we right, right. And as you mentioned last time about this issue about, professional standards like in other spaces like in psychology where uh, there are still issues around these, like any like or in terms of like ethics advisory boards and things like that, there are challenges to basically trying to mandate ethics, even from a legal standpoint. But and maybe and this is some of the criticism we get in the space, particularly around what quote unquote called underground use or even above ground legal use or research studies. They research studies have particular standards and protocols, and they do need to respect um, human boards of conduct, HRBs, human research boards. If I'm HIRBs, I'm like I'm going to mess this up, and all the ethics professionals are going to get on my case. But it's different. I mean, one is like, and this seems like a metaphysical epistemic move, but it's like one is to ask ourselves, like, well, um, are we trying to actually apply a standard of conduct? Are we trying to create rules and guidelines for everyone to follow in every condition, in every community, regardless of whatever type of practice, right?
Yeah, and as I think I mentioned last time, this isn't a thing that you can really do. Like you can't make. Well, you can make rules, but you either make your rules so general. If you make a rule general enough to apply to everything, you spend all your time trying to interpret it.
Right.
And if you make your rule specific enough so that it doesn't require interpretation, then your list of rules has to be infinitely long because you're writing for each specific circumstance under which a rule is applied. So there is kind of at the linguistic level, and maybe this is me digressing a bit because of my background in philosophy of language, is that, yeah, if you're, there's limits, not necessarily problems, but they're just limits with, when you are trying to, just in the whole basic sense of having a set of rules, when it comes to sort of interpreting them and how specific are you, how general are you? Again, as I mentioned last week, are your guidelines a prescriptive code of conduct? You must do this, you mustn't do that, or are they, like, is it prescriptive or is it aspirational? You should
Right.
try to do this. You should try to be that. You should aim to be this, which is a thing that some people argue is kind of more mirroring a sort of virtue ethics
Yeah, and
sort of
I'm all about, I
approach,
love
you know.
virtue ethics.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I love
I'm
all
on
the
the other
things,
side.
but like we can go on a whole thing about that. But like I want to
Yeah.
say like I definitely lean towards the more aspirational. And I know at least among Epic and like things that we've co-created together are more along the lines of community agreements, right?
Yeah.
Where like you're in a very, and again that's more specific, and usually they develop over time as the community changes and evolves and responds over time to the needs and desires of the community, and also based on what like kind of like the medium is the message sort of thing. What kind of medium are you using to which the community is bound, right? Like having a signal community, there are limits to what kind of enforcement you can do if that's the only place that your community exists. Similar, like if you're on another platform, a social media platform, or if you have a particular, like, I don't want to mention any particular brand, so I'm trying to avoid saying any of the brands. Although I don't mind supporting Signal because they're nonprofit, but but I think you understand because like, and maybe that's what we should, personally, I focus a lot on my own personal ethics and my personal standards, and then trying to reach community agreements and communicating about what those standards are for myself and in relationship with others, and building through relationships and what I like to call like an ecosystem relationship approach, uh, which I owe credit to a lot of the indigenous community traditions and not naming any particular one, but which I know is a problem in and of itself. But recognizing that a lot of even the way, our Western mindset has approached ethics or agreements or community hasn't actually been really supportive, hasn't really resulted in good, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and like the history of that is way beyond what we've kind of got time to talk about. But I think there is perhaps this is a sort of hangover from particular Western approaches to metaphysics or particular approaches to metaphysics, whether they're Western or not. It's a term that I'd come across recently with monorealism. There is the one or
Monorealism. Why don't you define that for
monorealism.
us?
Which is just the idea that there is reality is just one, or there is just one way to look at reality. Reality is
Yeah.
just one sort of thing. This is what's real. There is no discussion outside of that. But I think that's reflected sometimes reflected in our approach to ethics, and it's certainly been reflected in in philosophy, Western philosophy's approach to ethics and meta ethics, where we are looking for that what is the one right system? What is the is it what
The one
you
rule to
know
rule them all.
the one rule to all of all?
Here is
It's
the
never
gold
just
standard. Let me
yeah
let me
yeah
give you my
it's
Hammurabi code.
yeah, and people dedicating their entire careers to proving that a particular kind of utilitarianism is right, or a particular this is the approach, this is the grand unifying theory of ethics, and it's this one thing. Whereas anyone who's actually done any ethical work or taught ethics or thought about it for a bit knows that different ethical approaches uh, work in different situations, and that a lot of them have good things to say. Like you shouldn't be like there are problems with
Yeah, all the
taking a
theories have
particular
problems. Let's just make that clear. All the
all of
theories
them
have problems.
all the
No,
theories
none
have
of them,
problems,
there's no
but
unified
if you
theory that
there
solves
is
for
no
them all.
yeah
And whether you're looking at Western ethics or non-Western or decolonialized systems or any community, right? I often bring this up in terms of like, the idea that one person could speak for anything, right? Like, and other than
yeah
their own beliefs and their own experience or their own community or their own lineage or their own ancestry, right? I mean, and I mean this in the sense of like sometimes people are put in the position of having to answer for their whole culture, their whole race, their whole community, even though they're just one individual and they can't represent the interests necessarily of the whole community, the whole tribe. I mean, granted, people in leadership positions are often chosen to be the voice and steward of of ancestries and lineages, but I think sometimes when we look for the good, we misunderstand that uh, we can't, I mean, at least for me, can't really divorce ourselves from our subjective experience and relationships and histories, and that doesn't mean we can't come to some agreement. Uh,
Yeah, I think it's part of this. I mean, thinking about in terms of this is where for this is where maybe this is a struggle for some philosophers because we have to kind of get practical and pragmatic and understand that what are the things we can do? What are the areas that we agree on? Can we start with the areas that we agree on? And see if what are the areas that we agree on? Are there any areas that we're not going to agree on where we don't agree? Are the areas of disagreement deal breakers?
Yeah,
Um,
I love that. I
that
love that because, and I
that's
definitely have said that in
yeah,
community, right? You've probably heard
yeah,
me say it, where it's like, let's agree to disagree. And what can we agree upon? Like, can we at least agree to like share resources and information? You may totally disagree with my perspective, but can we at least share information? I know I did that with like the Decrim first group. Like I was like, can we at least share information? Like can we at least agree to disagree? Or like, can we at least agree to treat each other with respect? Can we have that be our baseline? um, and try and treat people with respect, like that ground
yeah,
in a practical sense, like practically speaking, it benefits all of us in an abundance exchange for us all to have greater information, knowledge, and resources.
yeah. And I think it's like important to note, kind of as a sideline, that in taking this pragmatic approach, you also need to. It's also okay and actually good to still recognize that there are actions or positions or value propositions that you might feel are beyond the pale
Yes, absolutely.
that are just completely unacceptable, and that if you disagree with someone or you disagree with a position to the point where there are serious uh deal breaking disagreements, then it's okay to disagree, and
Yes.
maybe even okay to be as this gets more serious in terms of ethical value, like the conflicts that you've identified, it might go from you know we can't work with them, I'm not talking to them, um, you know these are terrible views and no one should hold them because like that's a thing. They're just it's okay for to and actually good to think that there are some views that just no one should hold, or that there are some actions that are never justifiable, because that's part
Right.
of for me, that's part of doing ethics properly, and it's a whole thing that takes a long time to explain. But basically, I'm not one of these moral relativists who are going to be like, oh well, look,
Yeah.
everything's
No, let's
okay.
make that clear.
You
Neither of
know,
us are moral
yep,
relativists.
yep. You are never, you are very rarely, if ever, you're probably never going to hear me say, oh, about a moral ethical question, oh well, or, that's your truth, in a way that isn't sarcastic, because
Right.
so yeah, it's okay to identify those things, but within once you kind of have pulled in situations where it's not, where there aren't these sort of really serious deal breaking ethical concerns, um, like in just having the conversation, and some of the work is, well, it's funny. It's like I was going to say the work is the work, but like the conversation is the work, or the idea is the work, and the ideas are important, and spreading them is important. So the idea that you should have community agreements, or you can have had community agreements, the idea that the community does get to self-govern the expectations and norms by which everyone conducts themselves in particular contexts and spaces. Like those are good ideas, and worthwhile. The idea that yeah, you can have expectations, and getting people, because you can. It's funny, you could, if you got people, when we think about areas where it's problematic, where people with power abuse their position,
Right. Right.
um, and there's a whole range of ways that happens both above and below ground in psychedelics, as we've seen. If you get people just talking about this, It'll be amazingly enough, most people uh, are quite happy to come to the conclusion that maybe people in power shouldn't abuse their positions for personal, you know, gain.
Yeah, and I
Like,
love that because
and you don't have to you don't have to go in there and say, oh, look, you must do this. You must, your leaders must be held to
right,
this expectation.
thou
You just
shalt.
you just have the conversation, and people will, because people, maybe I don't know the psychology of it, maybe because people just naturally have a bit of a sense of their own self-interest. A lot of the time, people will just kind of go, well, yeah, actually, we should hold people to account. That there has to
Right.
be some way to keep people safe, and that just because you're a psychiatrist or you serve a really great brew, that doesn't mean you get to do whatever the hell you want
Yeah, there ought to be
with the
limits.
people
And
in your
and
care.
and
Yeah,
maybe this is just it. Like I love that you brought up the deal breakers. I love that we're like reinforcing the idea of community agreements. And also, and really this talks about containers and boundaries, healthy boundaries, right? That and having conversations, which obviously is what we're trying to do here, is even just having a space, a container where you can have the dialogue can help create the foundations of good practice.
yeah,
And I realize there's a bias there, but in cultural, I mean like that, obviously we can't talk everything out. There and there can be deal breakers, but even if you could at least have a conversation of what are those deal breakers for you? What are your boundaries? What are things like as you mentioned beyond the pale? And I think there's actually vastly more agreement in the psychedelic ethics space than there is disagreement. And I think that sometimes, when we think of, obviously we can't measure ethics, but we can recognize violations of harm, and that we can document, right? So like we can, even if we can't measure the good, um, and even if we don't agree on what's quote unquote bad, as it were, we can recognize that harms occur, and we can, or that there may be harms, or that someone has experienced like a psychological harm. I think about this a lot in terms of supporting survivors, and this came up in the signal communities in particular, right, where we wouldn't be able to document harms. We're not police, right? In case you thought this is going to be an ethics police show, this is not what this is, right? The law enforcement that are there in the various communities are chosen by those communities and those laws, and should be respected as such. But the fact of the matter is that when harms do occur in a community, you may not be able to document it. And
yeah,
it doesn't mean that it's not actionable just because you can't document it. And this is like this makes me think about reporting, and these are about like what can we do, right? If we can't measure the good, we can recognize when people are reporting experiences of harm. We can support people who are stating that. We can create limits that maybe are about community agreements about what kind of behaviors are expected and not expected, right? Or basis for removal. Uh, and I would say like, we always take the survivors at their word of their experience, because even if you feel that no documented harm has occurred, they are reporting harm. And their word of saying they're experiencing harm is an actual, truth, right? You don't have to, have like some sort of metaphysical agreement on reality to understand that someone is saying they experienced harm, even if the person did quote unquote all the right things, right? And I'm not saying that was the case, right? Most of the time, I'm finding that the facilitators or the container or something was actually problematic,
hmm,
right? Or that they weren't trauma informed, or they didn't appreciate uh, the how the sensitivity and the needs that weren't being met, right? So that they inadvertently cause harm, like that, there's like conscious harm, unconscious harm, right? But it's, kind of like murder, like like voluntary and involuntary manslaughter, at least in the United States, right? These ideas.
Yeah.
And I think, and even the bioethics principle, of, the strongest one is to do no harm, non-maleficence, right? So even if we can't measure the good or agree upon the good, even though I'm saying I think in general we can have a lot of agreement across cultures for a lot of different things, and we should recognize that. I think at the very least we need to create supports and systems to recognize that harms really do occur, and to do what we can to prevent harm.
Yeah, I think that's it. And like, there's part of what we can do to prevent harm is, and this is depending on the context. I mean, part of it comes back to like ha harms that occur are shaped by your expectations and your norms of practice in a field. And
Hmm.
I was thinking, about the ongoing discussions I see between different people I know about how to approach things like how do you approach process of psychedelic healing? How do you approach,
Mm.
what kind of like how do you think about, or how have you conceptualized something like inner healing intelligence, or these sort of ideas, and or the and this is not necessarily not I'm not necessarily saying that this is what I think, but when people talk about the way that some practitioners approach this is that they telepathically know what what their what the person in their care needs. And uh, you could argue that, and this is, without sort of committing to whether or not that's, that characterization is correct or not. If it was correct, and that, people think they know what clients need, but actually they don't, then addressing that practice is a way that you reduce harm, like so that but you need to have that discussion, and have the discussion about whether or not, like, is it a good practice? Is it a practice that works? Does it work for some people or not others? Some people seem to have a really great intuitive sense of about a lot of things. Some people don't. And in my personal experience of being a person who thought they had great intuition when they were younger but really didn't, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. So it's these kind of areas where you just talking about um, what is, there are lots of areas where you can kind of reduce harm through thinking about kind of the outcomes of practices. But the important thing is you have to have the discussion,
Yeah.
and you don't get to shut down the discussion because it's inconvenient. And
Well,
this
well,
is one of
speaking
the
of shutting
things
down the discussion, we're hitting 20 minutes now, and I'm cutting him off literally. But I want
already.
at least, in order to try and help wrap this up along the lines of what you're talking about, right? I think there's a lot of conflicts that happen in the space that actually are cultural differences, um, and 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 that where one or one context or one practice or one community, right? That this isn't considered a harmful practice in this community, but in another community, it is considered a harmful practice, right? Like, and I mean that, for example, like in Western notions of consent, that we won't generally touch people unless we have explicit consent, right? That's generally supposed to be the guideline, right? We're kind of
Or
like
we shouldn't.
touch
Yeah.
averse. Yeah, yeah, no, we shouldn't. Yeah, it doesn't mean that people don't, right? And one could argue that it's almost too extreme, or of, that we're not doing compassionate care. On the reverse, other communities or other cultures or other contexts, there's an expectation of physical support or engagement in an amount of care, right? That to not do that would be causing a harm. Um, and I just do this to kind of like, I realize I'm problematizing it, but but with the notion of like, okay, what can we do? Which is the question we started with, and I realize I feel like we opened it up endorse a little bit more for people than we helped to create resolution, which is maybe our nature, but but I think we can recognize healthy boundaries. We can do things to reduce harm and within the context we're in. We can, you know, have conversations like this where having the dialogue and communicating about what our needs are, what our boundaries are, what our limits are, what would be a harm to us, or having means through which we can have that conversation does help create better, more ethical practice.
Yeah, I think that that's certainly been my experience, and that's certainly what um, I think don't have time to talk about it today, but there is research and a pretty good body of evidence and tradition that yeah, talking about these things, just having the discussions helps, particularly, both for people in the communities. I mean, I think, for practitioners and people working in the field, absolutely need to have these discussions. And it's really, really good for people working in the field to have these discussions so that they're not caught unawares by ethical sort of situations when they pop up. But really great, just if there is more discussion of them, of these things, it is good. Uh, there are some caveats. There's always some caveats because I'm a
Always
philosopher.
caveats. Yeah.
There's always caveats, and discussion is just so before anyone objects. No, discussion is not always the answer, and the times that it's not an answer goes back to my previous sort of mentioning of things that are beyond the pale, and people who think that they're the right thing to do. That is the short
Yeah,
answer for
maybe we can engage that
when
next
discussion
time.
when
Yeah.
discussion is not always the answer,
It's an
but
ongoing conversation, right?
a lot of the time it is. Yeah,
We also would criticize us if you're just talking and you're not taking any action when you need to take action, when you do need to take a stand, when you need to advocate, when you need to, but but if we want to actually improve practice, dialogue and conversation is an essential component.
yeah,
So, as we wrap up today's conversation, as we hope to inspire you to have more of these conversations, to dialogue, to reflect, to think about, and consider that while we understand that measuring ethics is, unfeasible, impractical, and may even be unethical, uh, we there are things we can do, and at the very least we can have these conversations and move the conversation forward by not making it taboo. Maybe next time, feel free to give us your comments, ideas. You can go to the epicpsychedelic.com website. If you see inspiring practice, we're looking for your ideas and your contributions to the conversation, and looking forward to our next conversation.
excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.